Second, I'll be right back. Okay. All right, we already got an audience.
Right.
So I guess we'll just go ahead and start. Just 1 second. All right, we already got an audience. Oops.
Right.
So I guess we'll just go ahead and start.
I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah. No, I just muted it because I was making sure it was working on my end.
And I'm not seeing a lot of I'm not seeing participants on the Zoom feed.
Oh, on Zoom we have no participants. It's all on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we are. There's no echo now, right?
Good.
Okay, good. Okay, well, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you for coming back. I know it's virtual this time, but hopefully next time we will have you in person. But again, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that is watching online right now. Thanks for your support. Thanks for watching. We appreciate it. And just to get a couple of things out of the way, we will be having more of these events in the near future. So please stay tuned to our website and our emails, and we will have more great events like this in the future. And also, if you appreciate these events, please consider either donating or at least please, let your friends, family know about us and pass along the events for us. That would be great. So thank you all for watching. I hope everybody is doing well and is staying safe and healthy. So today we have, it's an honor and a pleasure again to welcome back Dr. Rashid Khalidi. We have a book talk today with him for his latest book, which is called The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017. So just to give a quick description about the book, before Dr. Rashid goes into detail. So this book it's about a landmark history of 100 years of war waged against the Palestinians from the foremost US historian of the Middle East, told through pivotal events and family history. So in 1899, more than 100 years ago, Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, mayor of Jerusalem, was alarmed by the Zionist call to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. And he wrote a letter aimed at Theodore Herzl. And the country had an indigenous people who would not easily accept their own displacement. He warned of the perils ahead, ending his note, "In the name of God, let Palestine be left alone." Thus, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, who is Yusuf al-Khalidi's great nephew,
Great
nephew, begins the sweeping history, the first general account of the conflict told from an explicitly Palestinian perspective. Drawing on a wealth of untapped archival materials and the reports of generations of family members, which includes mayors, judges, scholars, diplomats, journalists, the Hundred Years' War on Palestine upends accepted interpretations of the conflict, which tend at best to describe a tragic clash between two peoples with claims to the same territory. Instead, Dr. Khalidi traces 100 years war of colonial 100 years of colonial war on the Palestinians, waged first by the Zionist movement and then Israel, but backed by Britain and the United States. He highlights the key episodes in this colonial campaign, from the 1917 Balfour Declaration to the destruction of Palestine in 1948, or the Nakba, and then from Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon to the endless and futile peace process. Original, authoritative, and important, the 100 Years' War on Palestine is not a chronicle of victimization, nor does it whitewash the mistakes of Palestinian leaders or deny the emergence of national movements on both sides. In reevaluating the forces arrayed against the Palestinians, it offers an illuminating new view of a conflict that continues to this day. And just for everybody, most of you probably already know a lot about Dr. Rashid, but just a little bit about him. He is the author of Palestinian Identity, Brokers of Deceit, and The Iron Cage, among others. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and many other journals. He is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University in New York, and editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. And after this talk, if you would please, you can just search the title of the book. Please grab one. It's available as an ebook, as an audiobook, and in paperback and hardcover.
Actually, only in hardcover right now.
Oh, okay.
No paperback
Only in
yet.
hardcover, but it's still well worth grabbing it. So please do that. But without further ado, please welcome Dr. Rashid Khalidi. And thank you again, Dr. Rashid, and thank you to everybody that is watching online right now.
Thanks, Muhammad. Thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be hosted by the Palestine Center. I wish it was in DC. I wish it were live, but I'm afraid we're going to be dealing with this kind of virtual event for a very long time, unfortunately. But I'm really glad some people are able to tune in via Facebook. And I'm grateful to you guys for giving me the opportunity to talk about the book. I want to talk about two aspects of the book. One is that it's not a standard history of the conflict. I was pressed by my son, Smaid, by other friends and relatives to try and write a book that was more for the general reader than for a specialist audience, more for people who don't know a great deal about Palestine or who know a lot about Palestine but aren't experts. And I was also very strongly urged to include more personal information, to include more family material, mainly from my own family, but also from other families. And so I did something that's very different from any of the other 7 books that I've written, other 6 books that I've written, which is to say, I actually talked about myself, talked about experiences I had had, things I had witnessed, things people had told me. I tried at the same time to document everything quite rigorously. So for those of you who are interested in the historical details or in the sourcing, there are 45 pages of footnotes. You don't have to read them, but if you're interested in where I got some of the stuff I used, that's where you can find it. And so that's one aspect of the book. It has a personal tone to it, especially in the later chapters where I myself was involved. I tell a story of several things that my father told me. My father worked at the United Nations. My father had encounters with various people. I retell those stories. And then I talk about things that actually happened to me, whether during the siege of Beirut in 1982 or during the negotiations in Madrid and Washington, in both of which cases I was there, and I relate my own personal experiences. At the same time, This is the other aspect of the book. I'm trying to shift an existing false narrative in the United States about the conflict in Palestine. And that false narrative has to do with the idea that this is a tragic conflict between two peoples, two national movements. The best version of it says right versus right. And it's very, very sad. They both have claims, but they're more or less equal. And then given the sympathy that exists overall for Israel, the outcome is understandable. Poor Palestinians get left to the side. And moreover, this is essentially false framing. So this book, I think, uses a frame, and at the same time is meant to shift us away from this ridiculous idea of a struggle between equals. This has always been a monumentally unequal conflict between an indigenous people and a powerfully supported, externally based colonial movement, intending to implant new people in place of the indigenous population of the country. Now, this is therefore a settler colonial project. Zionism always was a settler colonial project in its own estimation, in its own self-description for its first 50 or 60 years. Herzl said that, founder of the modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, was very blunt about this. Both of them, in private in particular, made no bones about the fact that this was a settler colonial movement. At the same time, this is the complication, it was entirely unlike any other settler colonial movement in that it was also a national movement. It was not rooted in a metropole. So the French settlers who went to Algeria didn't set up a separate entity in Algeria. They considered themselves part of France. They had taken over Algeria for France, and they were an extension of the mother country. The same was true with British colonialists in North America or Australia or New Zealand. They did not intend at the outset to set up a separate, different state. They were part of a mother country. That's not true of Zionism. Zionism grew up among Jewish populations, persecuted Jewish populations of Eastern Europe, who chose to establish an entirely new national entity in Palestine. So I try and argue that what we're talking about in Palestine is a classical settler colonial case of settler colonialism, but with very important differences, such that in the end you do have two peoples, but not two peoples in a position of equality. Two peoples in which one has always been supported, that is to say the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel, by the greatest powers of their era. Great Britain had untrammeled power from World War I until World War II. It was the global hegemon. It supported Zionism to the hilt, right up to the eve of World War II. The United States, the Soviet Union became the superpowers. They're the ones that rammed through the partition resolution of 1947, which was the basis for Israeli statehood. It was the United States and the Soviet Union, with their arms deliveries, with their diplomatic support, with their financial support, that made the creation of the State of Israel possible. And it's been mainly American support, but also the support of others, Europe, some Arab governments, and others, without which Israel could not possibly have achieved the successes it has achieved. So you had a big thumb on the scale. It wasn't just tiny little Israel or the few Jewish settlers in the period before 1948 up against large numbers of Palestinians or even larger numbers of Arabs. It was, in fact, a very well-organized, very highly motivated settler colonial movement with a national focus and with the spur of persecution, of anti-Semitism, pushing people towards Zionism that faced the Palestinians. So that's the second aspect of the book. It has an analytical framework, which is based on this settler colonial paradigm, and which argues that you can best episodes, which I call declarations of war on the Palestinian people. The first of them being the Balfour Declaration, and then I talk about 5 others coming right up to the Trump plan, which in effect is the last of the 6 declarations of war on the Palestinians. So I'm arguing that this is not just a struggle between the Palestinian people, the indigenous population of Palestine, and a settler colonial movement that's created a new national entity. It is a struggle between the Palestinians and that settler colonial movement, now epitomized in Israel, with very powerful backing from the outside. So that's the basic thesis of the book. That's the argument I'm trying to make in it. I hope it's accessible and easy to read for people. I wrote it very differently than anything I've ever written. Most of the time I was thinking of a narrow audience of academics and specialists and experts and historians in the books that Mohammed mentioned, for example. By and large, they were written for specialist audiences. This was not written for a specialist audience. It's written for anybody who's interested in Palestine.
Yeah, and actually, I looked at it, and it does seem like something that could be easily read by anybody, especially somebody that's interested in the history. But it does seem like something that could be. It doesn't. It's very accessible to everybody. So that's great.
Yeah, that was my most important objective in writing this book. I mean, I've experienced an enormous change in academic writing on Palestine when I was an undergraduate, and later on when I was a graduate student in the United States and then in the United Kingdom. There were very few sources on Palestine that weren't either biased or basically unsympathetic to, not only unsympathetic to the Palestinians, but that framed the conflict in a way that I understood from my own experience and my knowledge of the history through my own family and through my own experiences to be largely false. That's not the case today. Today, there's a very wide range of very solid academic writing that I think properly frames this conflict. And I don't think that there's that on the academic level, on the scientific level, we're in the situation we were in 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. The Palestinian narrative and an objective narrative is actually available to anybody who's interested. The Zionist narrative is still out there with all of its faults, but at least people today have a choice between largely false history and largely, accurate history. And so, in terms of what's available academically and to specialists, I think we've really turned a corner. In American universities, some of the ridiculous lies that have been peddled by Zionism since the very beginning, land without a people, for a people without a land, making the desert bloom, and so on and so forth, are entirely discredited in academic circles that specialize in anything to do with literature or society or history.
Well, it's
Go ahead.
It's not just academic circles, but also, like, for example, my dad, who, my grandfather could name more even, but my dad himself could name like 8 generations of his grandfathers that lived in the village in Palestine that we come from. So it's academic, but it's also just people live there. I mean, like you said, a land without a people. I mean, that's just completely false.
Of course. That's something else I try and give voice to in this book, which is the lived experience of people, of Palestinians, is completely ignored. I mean, there are whole books on the Nakba, for example, by the Israeli historian, I'm blanking on his name, Benny Morris, which in fact accurately described massacres, expulsions, ethnic cleansing, though he will not use that term, but which rigorously refuse to accept the narratives of the 750,000 of Palestinians who were forcibly uprooted from their homes. So that voice is not in much of the history, I should say. That's now being corrected. So the kinds of experiences that your family had, I mean, how your great grandparents lived in the same village that your parents or grandparents grew up in. I know how my own ancestors lived in Jerusalem. I mean, there are records. We know. I sit there and I talk to people and they tell me about their great grandparents in my own family. Those elements I tried to bring in. Now, your family is not characteristic, Mohammed. My family is not characteristic. But together, these are accounts from a Palestinian perspective which are completely ignored. And so, even though my own family is, perfectly unrepresentative in many ways, I try and bring in things that I learned from my aunts and my uncles, things I knew about my grandfather and my grandmother, and so on. And I try and bring those things in because that lived experience of the Palestinians has been something that there's been an insistence on excluding. Because if the Palestinians can't speak for themselves, if the Palestinians don't have what Edward Said called permission to narrate, then they can be excluded. Then they don't exist. And of course, that's the whole point. If you're substituting one people for another, one of your primary objectives is to make out that people doesn't really exist. They're not real. There's some folks there, but they're of no account. And in the incident that you relate, where my great uncle wrote to Herzl, Herzl's reply to him, which I cite in the book, indicates that he considered the Palestinians of no account. They could be ignored. He did reply. He very courteously replied to Yusuf al-Khaldi. But his reply showed something that I argue is symptomatic of Zionism and of many of Zionism's supporters in the United States and Britain. Palestinians are not important. We don't have to pay attention to them.
Yeah, they're expendable.
They're expendable. And in order for that maneuver to be successful, they have to be disappeared. They have to be denied permission to narrate. And that's one of the many things that this book and much other stuff that's out there now is trying to argue against.
Great. How long did this book take you to with the research and everything? I mean, we all know the history is there, but how long did it take you to research everything?
Well, there are two possible answers to that question. The easy answer is I actually conceived of and wrote the book in the form in which it came out over the last 3 or 4 years. It took me a little more than 4 years. But in fact, there are issues and incidents and important episodes in that book that I had researched and thought about and written about going back decades. The chapter on 1982, for example, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the siege of Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacres are things that I experienced, things I actually wrote an entire book about. I wrote a book called Under Siege, which is about the PLO's decision to leave Beirut. I did an entirely new research in the course of the last 3 and 4 years using documents I had never seen before. Israeli documents, American documents, which show things about the Sabra and Shatila massacres, things about American complicity in the war that when I wrote the earlier book, I wasn't fully aware of. In fact, nobody was aware of. This is the first time some of this stuff has been published. Similarly, I wrote a whole book on the negotiations in Washington and Madrid that I was a part of. But since then, I have done new research. So there are aspects of this book that I've been doing research on for decades, actually. And some of that research I've used as the basis for books that I've written before. But this is new in the sense that I have all kinds of new material that is added here. And I've added a lot of material that I would never have put in a purely academic book. So on the one hand, it took me 3 to 4 years, but really I've been working on aspects of this book for 30 or 20 years.
And so this new archival material that you uncovered, how is it being preserved? I mean, because my grandparents are the ones that left Palestine, for example. So, and my grandparents have all passed away. So how will these types of things be preserved moving forward for the new generations? I mean, I have full confidence, honestly, even the Palestinian youth nowadays are still very firmly, in support of this struggle. But how do you think these things will be preserved moving forward? Do you have any recommendations about that? Because frankly, we can't rely on any Israeli source to that's not going to happen.
Part of the problem.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mohammed. Let me start from the end because what you mentioned is really important. One of the things that the process of disappearance of the Palestinians entails is to disappear their history. So there has actually been a war on the Palestinian archive. Israel attacked the PLO Research Center in Beirut several times, ultimately seizing the archives of the PLO Research Center. They were later returned to the PLO as a part of a prisoner exchange. It shut down the Arab Studies Society in Jerusalem. It's still shut down. The materials that were stolen from the PLO in 1982 and from the Arab Studies Society in the 1990s, I believe, or 2000, 2001, I believe, were then taken to the Israel State Archives and put in under a category called abandoned property, AP.
Right.
Together with books that had been stolen in 1948 from Palestinian libraries in Jaffa, Haifa, and West Jerusalem. So there's a whole body of Palestinian history, which Israel has basically stolen. And so if you want to access it, you can access it through the Israel State Archives. But you have to be able to go to Israel, get security clearance, and be able to speak Hebrew, and be allowed to see these materials. Other materials are in the Israel State Archives, where the same kind, an even more rigorous vetting process is necessary. So Israel has stolen, seized, and taken advantage of a variety of archives for Palestinian history. Let's start from there. And that's not a casual process. That's not an accidental process.
Yeah, it's
that is an intentional.
Yeah.
Okay. The answer to your question is multiple. There are multiple answers to your question. What do we do about this? Well, the first thing we do is we preserve records. And now this can be done on an individual basis, but it's best done institutionally. So one of the things that the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut does is to try and and in Ramallah. There's a branch in Ramallah, there's a branch in Beirut. We have an office in Washington, D.C. as well. But the archives are in either Beirut or in a safe place outside of Beirut or in Ramallah. And they're being digitized. So even if the actual physical paper or document or photograph is la samahallah, is destroyed, there's a permanent record of it.
Yeah,
in a safe
place. And I feel digitization is the key nowadays. Is once it's somewhere on the internet, it's basically there forever.
Right. Well, you have to protect it. There are ways and you also have to spend a lot of money updating your digital platforms.
Right.
Because I have written and stored material on platforms that are completely inaccessible in 2020, back in the 1990s and the early part of this century. The final part of the answer to your question is oral history. This is and there are a number of pioneers of oral history: Rosemary Sayegh, Maysay Ali, pioneers, Julie Petit, a number, mainly anthropologists and historians, and the people at the American University of Beirut Library, who've put together a Nakba archive, and others, many others are doing this. Bir Zayt has done a wonderful job on this. And these are archives not just of the Nakba, but of everyday life in villages, of social relations in Palestinian cities, and so on and so forth. This is very, very important. And this is something they can't seize, in a sense, once it's digitized and recorded. Obviously, not anybody can record oral history. You have to have the right kinds of questions, which requires a certain kind of historical background. It requires a training in oral history. But if you have those things, it can be done very simply. And I mean, I would urge everybody, ask your grandmothers or grandfathers. It's mainly the grandmothers and the aunts who are still alive.
Right. Yeah.
Ask your grandmothers and your aunts, and if they're alive, your grandfathers and your uncles. Anything you can ask them, or your parents even, while they are still, able to remember and their memories are good, and record it. It is of enormous value. Every time somebody dies, a memory goes out of the world that is irretrievable.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's the one thing that I regret, but it's kind of not my fault. But my paternal grandfather passed away in '98. I was young at the time, so I couldn't do that. My maternal grandfather passed away in 2008. But I really wish that I had just, taken a voice recorder and had them, speak about this kind of stuff. So like you said, anybody who's listening and that has Palestinian grandparents that lived through the Nakba and were in Palestine, I would highly recommend just sit down with them for an hour or so and just take down their memories, their stories, because like you said, the oral history is very important, and if we don't record it, then it's going to be lost forever.
It's particularly important in the Palestinian case because we have never had and do not have a state.
Exactly.
Normally, states take charge of things like historical memory. They do it badly or they do it well, but they do it. You have national archives, you have national museums, you have all kinds of national institutions for commemorating the past of the nation. The Palestinians, we have never had those things. We've never had a state, and we've therefore never had those kinds of state institutions. We have some wonderful civil society institutions, some wonderful NGOs. We're cursed by not having a state, but we're also blessed by not having a state because it's forced others to take up the slack. The last thing I'll say is that about this is that even a trained historian has the same regrets that you have. I and many of my friends who work in the historical field can't forgive ourselves for not having asked enough questions when we were young enough to have access to the memories of the oldest people in our families. I used some of my aunts and uncles as sources for material I worked on. I actually did research. I wrote a whole paper based largely on something that my aunt, told me back in Beirut in the late 1970s. And I used especially my other aunts and some of my uncles and some of my older cousins as sources. But I kick myself day in, day out for not having done more of that. So I would say this is true for Palestinians and non-Palestinians. If you want to know about your family, ask people while they're still around. My kids ask me questions I can't answer. My parents are gone. My wife's parents are gone. We can't answer questions that our children ask us about our own families. So take advantage of people while they're still there. Their memories are treasure trove.
Sure. So how do you think moving forward? I mean, we're kind of at this point where, at first you would think things would get better over time, but as you know, things are getting worse politically, at least, with everything going on with Israel and its annexation plans. The right of return, which applies to my family, for example, because we come from a village that's in the Galilee. So how do you see this moving forward? I mean, what is it going to take for Palestinians to actually receive justice for what happened to them? I mean, I have family members that are sitting in refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria, for example, and they would love nothing more than to just go back to where they came from.
Right.
So, what do you think moving forward? How is this going to play out? What do you think it's going to take?
I mean, that's a very big question, and I'll do my best to answer it. The first thing it's going to take is a upheaval among Palestinians. The Palestinian national movement has seen ups and downs in the century and a little more since World War I. And it's now in one of its deepest troughs, one of its lowest points. It's divided. It has a bankrupt leadership. It has no political strategy whatsoever. There is no strategy. There's a bankrupt strategy in Ramallah, a failed strategy in Ramallah, and there's a failed strategy in Gaza. And the two of them together have done less to further the Palestine cause than a bunch of civil society organizations. I mean, BDS has done more for Palestine. Student activists in the United States and Europe have done more for Palestine, furthering the Palestinian cause than both governments have done in their entire existence. In fact, they pushed the Palestine cause backwards at a time when civil society was managing to push it forward. So the first thing is that we as Palestinians have to get our act together. And that is going to be very difficult. There are powerful actors that are working day and night to keep the Palestinians divided, not just Israel, not just the United States. Major Arab countries have as their primary objective keeping the Palestinians and other parts of the Arab world weak and divided and undemocratic. So that's a big hurdle to overcome. But that's the first step. You have to have some kind of unified national movement and some kind of clear strategic objective before you can expect to get anywhere. I mean, it's the absolute precondition. And we're not there, and we may not be there for a little while, but that is the first thing. The second thing is another precondition for keeping the Palestine question off the front burner and keeping the Palestinians weak and divided is dictatorial, unrepresentative governments in the Arab world that are weak and dependent on outside forces, that are the playthings of outside forces. This has been a constant since the 1930s, when the Arab states first became involved in the Palestine question. It was a problem in the 1940s, and it's been a problem ever since. In fact, it is one of the major problems today. It's not just Arab states, it's also regional states. Turkey, Iran are fishing in troubled waters in Palestine, playing this faction off against the other. And part of this is due to a lack of democracy in the Arab world. It's also due to rivalries and other things. And so the idea that the Palestine struggle is separate from what happens in the Arab world is actually false. It's always been intimately related to the situation of the Arab world. As long as the Arab countries are weak and divided and led by unrepresentative, undemocratic governments, the Palestine question is not going to take the place that it should. And it'll be impossible for the Palestinians by themselves, even if they were to restore their national unity and decide on a clear political strategy, it would be impossible for them to do it all by themselves. They need support from the region. And to have that, you need democratic governments. If you look at the governments that are the most engaged in massive normalization with Israel, they are the most dictatorial, they are the most absolute monarchies or military dictatorships. If you look at the countries where it's much harder to push through normalization, where there is public support for the Palestinians, it's countries like Tunisia, Lebanon, where you have some forms of democracy. Even Morocco and Jordan and Kuwait, which have problematic systems, are countries where there is public opinion that expresses itself in favor of Palestine, and governments can go only so far. Watch the situation in the Sudan. Civil society is supportive of the Palestinians. The military, supported by autocratic Gulf regimes in this evolving Sudanese political situation, the military is normalizing with Israel.
Right.
So those regimes, it's not for the Palestinians to change them, it's for the peoples in the Arab world. But that is a struggle that has to also work out. Finally, if you accept that Zionism is a settler colonial project, and you accept that the state of Israel, although it's a very powerful state, nation state, although the Israeli people are people that exist and they have an enormous amount of strength as a people. We've seen this again and again. This idea that Israel is some kind of weak, easily divided society is complete nonsense, peddled only by people who know nothing whatsoever about Israel. In spite of that, it is dependent on the outside world. It's particularly dependent on Europe, which does most of the trade with Israel. Israel's almost all, the vast bulk of Israel's trade is with Europe. The vast bulk of investment in Israel is from the United States. It's not just investment by companies like Microsoft or Motorola or whatever. It's billions and tens of billions of dollars that come to Israel in the way of charitable 501c3 contributions. Friends of the IDF, friends of Hadassah Hospital, friends of this, friends of that. Billions of dollars.
Well, friends of IDF they raised tens of millions in just one night, just from one. Yeah.
So changing that situation, daunting though it may seem, in Europe and the United States, is something that actually is also essential. So Palestinian unity, some improvement in the Arab situation, and a proper attention to the importance of the United States in Europe. I mean, it was the Balfour Declaration that started this.
Right.
That was Britain. It wasn't the Zionists. Right. The British decided for their own reasons. It was the partition resolution. That was the Americans and the Soviets. It was Security Council Resolution 242. That was the Americans and the Israelis. So the 1982 war, the Americans and the Israelis. So there's this external dimension, which sadly Palestinian leaderships in the past and in the present have been too ignorant, too blinded by narrow concerns, too incapable of understanding the world balance of power to pay proper attention to. This was true in the 20s and the 30s, when there was a misunderstanding of the global balance of power and the importance of working in Britain. It was true with the PLO. For all of their successes globally, and they had some of the biggest achievements of the Palestinians were the PLO's diplomatic successes in winning representation and getting the Palestinian voice heard for the first time in history. At the same time, those leaders were very short-sighted and foolish,
Right.
and in their understanding of the United States. They thought, if we can talk to Schultz or if we can talk to Baker, then we solve the problem. No, you don't solve the problem. You have to be talking to churches, you have to be talking to unions, you have to be talking to universities, you have to be talking to public opinion, civil society. You don't go to the top. This is not an absolute monarchy like some of the Gulf countries, where you go to the king or the emir or the sultan and the problem is solved. No, the United States is a complicated political system, as are the countries of Europe, and it requires a lot of work. To be fair, to give this work its due, a lot of that work is actually being done by Palestinian civil society in cooperation with students and others, church groups and unions and so on and so forth in the United States and Europe. And there has been an enormous improvement in public opinion in these countries, in spite of a counteroffensive fueled by tens of millions of dollars, with lawyers up the wazoo, with organizations, AstroTurf organizations all over the place, and with real political support in some legislatures, in the US Congress, in the German political system, in the French political system. In spite of all of that, there have been enormous achievements on American campuses, in important American liberal Protestant denominations, and so on and so forth. So that is a third element to get out of the mess we're in. None of this is going to happen tomorrow.
Right.
Zionism did not achieve what it achieved in the United States because in 1947 or in 1967, an Israeli leader said, we're going to go and talk to Harry Truman, or we're going to go and talk to Lyndon Johnson. It's because people like Ben Gurion himself and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the second president of Israel, were working in the United States in 1917, 1918, 1919, working hard.
Herzl himself. I mean, they were working on this from a long time ago.
Precisely. It's going to require a lot of long-term work before you're going to see a result. But that work is being done, actually, or it's begun. For the first time, I think, in Palestinian history. I don't think that there has been an effort like we're seeing in the last decade or 15 years, at least in the United States.
Well, thank you. That was actually the very thorough answer to that question. And that really sums up everything that probably should be done. So thank you for that. I have a question for you from Mr. Saeed Arakat, who is actually on our Palestine Center Committee. He's also the bureau chief of the Al-Quds daily newspaper here in Washington.
I read his reports all the time.
Okay, great.
He just sent out one this morning.
Yeah, he does one, I think, daily, pretty much.
Right.
So he's asking, given all the history that is cited in today's presentation, knowing the facts as they are, what ought to be the one urgent priority or rallying cry that Palestinians should start working on, organizing around immediately? Like what should they do immediately? He said maybe totally independent from the current traditional leadership. So what are your thoughts on that? And if you want, I can repeat the question if you didn't.
No, I got it. I mean, first I would go back and say we need to unify our national movement. So some form of unity. I frankly think that the two political movements that dominate politics inside Palestine are bankrupt. I don't think they can be the basis for the future. But there has to be a minimum of unity, and there has to be some strategic clarity. We have to decide what we want. I would suggest that the slogan should be something to do with justice and equality. Now, how you implement justice and equality in Palestine opens up a whole series of questions, but that has to be the basis. There has to be absolute equality on an individual basis. Every Israeli Jew and every Palestinian Arab has to be treated on the basis of equality. Whether it's in one state, many states, or a single state is not important. The important thing is the principle. And each of those two groups have acquired national rights. You know, nations are not just, noble, honorable outgrowths of history. Nations are created, by people's consciousness, and they're often created through unjust processes of conquest or expropriation or colonization. I and you live in a nation state created by colonial expropriation. I live in a city and I live in New York City, and I'm today in Chicago, named for Native Americans. This is a colonial settler project that's turned into a nation state. It's based on that and slavery. You live in Washington, D.C. Every one of the oldest buildings there was built by slaves, never compensated for their labor. The White House and the Capitol, slave built. That's the basis of the United States. It's a tragic history, but it's a nation state. The same is true of Israel and the Israeli people. And we like it, we don't like it. That has nothing to do with it. Like many other national groupings, we are a national grouping as well, we the Palestinians. So when you say equality and justice, there has to be complete equality in terms of the people's rights. And that's not just political rights, that's not just civil rights, that's not just rights to property, that's also rights to national existence. How that national existence is exercised is a matter for a debate and a struggle over a long time. But to say they don't have the right to some kind of communal identity and we do, or for them to say they have the right to a community, which the nation state law of 2018, the Jewish nation state law of 20, it said they have the right of communal identity, we don't.
Right.
There's one people in the land of Israel, the Jewish people. Well, that's inadmissible. That's unacceptable. It's also unacceptable to say we're the only people in the land of Palestine. There's another people there, created by a settler colonial process, but it's there. Our brothers and sisters who live inside Israel understand that a hell of a lot better than most other Palestinians. They understand exactly what has been created there. Forcibly, they've been made a part of it, a subordinate, discriminated against part of it, but they're part of it. And they understand it perfectly well. I hope other Palestinians will come to understand that. So that means that if somebody who has a relative in Brooklyn can bring them and they become a citizen as soon as they arrive at Ben Gurion Airport, then someone who lives in Amman should be able to come and become a citizen as soon as they arrive.
Right.
When you say justice and equality, you include things that we talk about in terms of the right of return or an end of occupation or self-determination. You don't narrow yourself down to a political path that is harder to explain. You say, just as in the United States, everybody has equal rights. Everybody in Palestine has to have equal rights. So justice and equality would be in my view, the broadest framing that we should adopt.
Okay, I have another question for you from Dr. Subhi Ghandour, who is with the Al-Hiwar Center here, also in the DC area. So he is asking about the role of the Palestinians here in the US regarding the situation in Ramallah and the Arab world, and how to, I guess, push a good Palestinian lobby here in the US.
Okay, those are two different questions. Let me talk about the last part, which is the easiest part. You only have an Israel lobby in the United States because people like Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben Zvi started working on it 100 years ago. We Palestinians who live in the United States. Most of us arrived much later than most of the Jewish population.
Right.
And that means we have there's a different timeline for us. It took Jews in the United States centuries before they achieved any level of equality, before they were free of many forms of discrimination. And that took a huge struggle. And out of that, they eventually developed powerful community organizations. We're not anywhere near them in terms of a timeline. There are some people who arrived before World War I, before the racist immigration laws of 1924 were put into place, but most Palestinians, most Arabs, most Muslims in the United States arrived after 1965. So we're 100 or 85 years after most other immigrant groups or many other immigrant groups in developing our own communal institutions and in assimilating. Now that's beginning to happen. I look at my children's generation, I look at my students, Arab American, Palestinian American students, and you can see a completely different outlook than existed when I was a student. When I was a student, most Arab Americans or most Arabs in the United States were completely outside of American society. They were not assimilated. They did not feel comfortable. My children's
They just
generation
wanted to
was still
avoid. They just wanted to avoid trouble and just lay low.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
Or they fought against it, but they were clearly outside of the society. That's less and less true today, especially with the younger generation. And so that's the basis for doing anything. Those people have to already understand what has to be done. They know American law. They feel perfectly American, and at the same time they are loyal to their roots, as it were.
Right.
Now, lobbying is not something that's done in Washington. It doesn't start at the top. Our fallacy is, if I can talk to Baker, I will solve the problem. No, you don't talk to Baker. You have people in municipal councils. You have people in state legislatures. You have people in the US Congress who talk to Baker. So Baker or Trump or whoever it may be can't ignore you because you have a political base. And you don't do that just by organizing your own people. You do it by intersectionality, talking to Muslims, talking to Indians who are not nationalist, talking to African Americans, talking to Hispanics, talking to LGBTQ groups, talking to church groups, so that anybody who is open-minded enough to listen to the message supports you, and you support them. Our cause is not unique and perfect and the only important thing in the world, which is a fallacy, Palestinian, that we think we're the center of the world. We're not the center of the world. Every one of the groups that I've talked to believes that they are the center of the world. Right. And we have to respect that. If we want them to support us, we have to support them. That's what lobbying involves. Yeah. Getting the base so that you can get to the top.
That reminds me actually of a speaker we had at the Palestine Center a year or two ago. And he was mentioning what you said. It doesn't start at Washington. He was mentioning how even on local city councils, the Zionist groups would basically take them on trips,
right.
Over to Palestine. So it starts at the local level because they know that some of these local politicians might end up having ambitions to be in state or national level politics. So it starts from the bottom and then trickles upward, right. Actually.
A famous Massachusetts politician once said, all politics is local. That's where it starts. And it started. I mean, in Paterson, New Jersey, we have a Palestinian mayor. In various parts of this country, there are people running for office, many all over the place. In Texas, in Illinois, in Brooklyn. Those are neighborhoods and areas where there's a large enough population. And the ones who win are ones who don't just organize Arab Americans or Palestinians. They're the ones who can create coalitions. This is a country where ethnic groups still matter. And you have to create coalitions across those ethnic groups and across interest groups. That's what the Israel lobby does. You think they're obsessively focused on Israel? They are not. That's their objective. But they and every lobby in Washington does what it does by doing favors for other people at the same time that they get favors for their own cause. That's the way politics works.
Right. I have a question for you online from our online viewers. From Layla Cable. She says she's a retired Palestinian helping to develop ethnic studies for, I guess, a public school system. And she's asking, could your book or others be a good one for them? I guess as a primary source without writing a new one for use as a primary source. So can your book be used in their curriculum?
I mean, I don't know what their curriculum is. I don't know what level of schooling it is. It's hard for me to answer that. I can say though that I think that a proper curriculum would probably include excerpts, if not from my book, then from books like mine.
Sure.
I mean, maybe in a high school, you could use a better part of a chapter. Maybe if you're talking about middle school, much smaller. Right. Ideally, you'd have books written for those age groups, certainly below high school. And again, it depends on the high school. I mean, education in the United States being what it is, a lot of kids would have great difficulty reading even selections
Right.
from some of the kind of books that you would want them to read. So I think it depends on the school system. Also, I'm not I've spent my whole life in university education. I'm no expert on how you would address curricular needs of people in K through 12.
Sure. Okay, another question is, this was going back to the whole oral history question, is there an ongoing project in the refugee camps across the Arab world to record these older people's stories from the Nakba and everything? Is there an ongoing project for that?
The ones I'm best aware of are in the West Bank and Lebanon, where there are projects actually, pretty comprehensive. Also, Tman al-Arba'in, also some Palestinians inside Israel. And there are both efforts at the village level, so things like village books, which record legends, stories, histories, narratives, folklore and history mainly, and geography of different villages. And then you also have oral history compilations, local and regional. And then you have a variety of places. In Beirut at the American University, there is an oral history center for Palestine, for the Nakba specifically. And they have worked in camps all over Lebanon. And in fact, with many Palestinian refugees from Syria being forced, especially from Yarmouk near Damascus, being forced to leave and take refuge in Lebanon, they've had access to both groups. Palestinian refugees living in Syria formerly and Palestinian refugees. I don't know about Jordan. I actually don't know.
Okay. So let me see if, sorry, let me just check and see if we have any more questions right now. None right now, but I would ask you is, how would you, I mean, just as a quick like summary of the concluding remarks for your book, what would you say? For somebody also that's maybe not so well versed in this conflict, that doesn't know the details, and how would you describe that?
Right. Well, one thing I would say is that the project to create Israel and to, in effect, replace the indigenous population with a new population came a century or 2 centuries too late. A colonial settler project like that had been started in the 18th or 19th century might have had a chance of succeeding by either eliminating the population, as happened in much of North America and much of Australia and New Zealand, or expelling them, or subjugating them fully. That did not happen. The fact that between the river and the sea in historic Palestine, the majority of the population are Palestinians, in spite of all the efforts at ethnic cleansing, at keeping people out, forcing others to leave, is an indication that the project was not a success. Secondly, I would say, and this is something I say in the last chapter of the book, Israel is entirely dependent on liberal democracies. Its values do not comport with the values of liberal democracy. It is not one man, one woman, one vote. It is not the same law applies to all. There are laws that privilege Jews in Israel. There are laws that discriminate against Arabs. In a liberal democracy, that is simply unacceptable. There's a single rule of law that applies to all citizens. That not only doesn't apply to all Israeli citizens, it doesn't apply to the 4.5 or almost 5 million Palestinians that Israel has ruled over for 53 years.
Right.
So this is a system that is completely incompatible with the liberal democracies on which it relies largely, the United States.
And not to mention the discrimination that they have even against, the African Jews in Israel.
Exactly.
I mean, I saw that firsthand, and it was pretty obvious that there was discrimination against them.
Well, I mean, many countries have discrimination, but except apartheid South Africa and Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, that was not expressed in law. In Israel, it's expressed in law. There is legally mandated discrimination. If you're of one religion, you have certain rights. If you're of another, you're deprived of those rights. And in fact, if you live in the occupied territories, you have absolutely no rights whatsoever. no rights whatsoever. You're under the control of an arbitrary authority that you have no influence on, a military authority that decides whether you can register your child, whether you can import, whether you can leave, whether you can export, whether you can drill a well. Anything important is decided by this external arbitrary authority. That is completely incompatible with the ideals of liberal democracy. And so I would argue that that's a reason for optimism. It's simply necessary to bring those facts to light, and you put Israel in a very difficult position. Obviously, it requires much more than just doing that.
Sure. Let's see. I got another question here. Well, I'm not sure. Let's see. For many years, we spoke about Israel accepting its moral and legal responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians. How important is that for a just peace?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good question. You know, we live in a country, the United States, where some people have all kinds of privilege, mainly economic and class privilege. To get people to give that up is very hard. In Israel, there are powerful structures that reinforce privilege for Israeli Jews, especially Ashkenazi Jews, but any Jew, any Israeli Jew has rights that others don't have. And those privileges are going to have to be given up if there's going to be a basis, any equal basis for a society or societies in Palestine. And overcoming that is not going to be easy. It's going to require the Palestinians to do things that are going to be very difficult for us, because we're going to have to show Israelis that there is a future in which they can live on a basis of equality, and that they have to give up enormous privilege and some power in order to get there. So that is not an easy task, especially for the people who have suffered as a result of the establishment of Israel. I mean, what's required of the Palestinians is much harder than what's required of the Israelis. All the Israelis have to do is to give up a lot of false notions and a lot of privilege in order to be accepted on a basis of equality. But that requires their giving up some power, a lot of privilege, and a lot of very false, in many cases, very racist notions about the people that shares that country with them, however unequal that sharing is right now.
Okay, we have another question that said, and I don't know if you really mentioned this, but the person says that you included Iran with Arab states that seek to keep Palestinians weak.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I included Iran and Turkey, yes.
And then this person says, my view is that Iran has been more principled on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at great cost to itself. Please comment.
You know, I'm not particularly interested in wading into a dispute that has probably caused more trouble than it's worth. It's similar to a dispute over the role of the Syrian regime. I mean, we have Palestinians who would much rather fight each other over whether Hafez al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad or the Iranian regime is good or bad for the Palestinians than they are in doing something about Israel. I'd much rather that we put those issues aside. I think that there are three powerful nation states in the Middle East: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Those three nation states have a great deal of autonomy. They act in their national self-interest. They do not act on behalf of anybody or for anybody. They act at the behest of elites and leaderships, but which are operating in the service of that nation state. That's as true of the Iranian leadership or of the Turkish leadership as it is of the Israeli. Whether you like them or you don't like them, those are facts. Right. There's a second fact. There's no Arab state that is autonomous. There's no Arab state that's not weak and dependent. There's not one single, that was not true in the past. Egypt, other Arab states had a certain degree of autonomy and a certain degree of power. None of them have very much power, and none of them have any autonomy. They are weak playthings for external forces, mainly great powers, United States, Russia, and others, but also regional non-Arab powers, whether it's Iran or it's Turkey or it's Israel. And I'm not putting them on a basis of equality. I'm talking in terms of sheer power and also sheer national objectives. If anybody thinks that the Iranians are sacrificing for the brown eyes of the Palestinians and not for their own national interest, then they don't understand Iran. Iran does things that may or may not benefit the Palestinians. It's doing them because it's beneficial to them. The British did not establish Israel, did not issue the Balfour Declaration because they were Philo-Semites or because they loved Jews. They did it for British imperial
Yeah,
interests. The United
that's what it
States
comes
does
down
what it
to.
does
Yeah,
for American national interests. Iran does what it does for Iranian national interests. Now,
right.
those are nation states. And in all three cases, they have some elements of democracy, by the way, for however authoritarian Erdogan is, however dominated the Iranian regime is, however undemocratic Israel is in the way it rules over the Palestinians. They have elements of democracy. That's not true of most major Arab states.
Right. We have another
So
question.
I would argue that we're not. This is not a slur on Iran. It does what it does in its own national interest.
Yeah. This person said that they visited the refugee camps in Lebanon years ago. They're asking, do you see any hope for some Palestinians to return? I know, I mean that this ties to the previous question, but and if not, like, where would they go elsewhere? I mean, is there anywhere else they can go?
Well, I mean, it's the case of Lebanon and Palestinians in Lebanon and of Palestinians from Syria who have been forced out of Syria because of the fighting around Damascus in particular, and Yarmouk camp, is a very tragic one. There is an effort to get them to emigrate from Lebanon, which has reduced the Palestinian population in Lebanon by a very large proportion. Some people emigrate and are forced to come back, but many emigrate. And so you have in Scandinavia and Germany and in other parts of Europe, literally hundreds of thousands of people who originated in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon
Right.
or Syria. Okay. Literally hundreds of thousands, 100, 200, nobody knows. There's no proper numbers. But there is some work done on the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, and their population has actually declined. What should be, with natural growth and no emigration, a population of 500,000 or 600,000 in Palestinian refugees in Lebanon has been reduced to a couple of 100,000, and that's a result of emigration. Now, is there a possibility of return? Of course, there's a possibility of return. It's going to require all of the changes that I talked about. Palestinian national movement has to be revived and reunified and get a strategy. There have to be some positive changes in the Arab world, and there are going to have to be major efforts done to weaken the support that the United States and Europe in particular give to Israel. I mean, I talk about all of these things in the book, and I would hope that anybody who's really interested in a full answer to that very good question would actually have a look at the book.
Yeah, and that's why everybody watching should buy a copy of the book, because it's a great book with a lot of historical research and just a great summary of everything. So everybody watching, please buy a copy of this. You can just search it. It's The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. You can buy it online. You get a paper hardcover, right? Not the paperback.
Or Kindle or
Kindle
audiobook.
or audiobook. Yeah, so
I read the first chapter of the audiobook.
So, oh, you read the first chapter?
Right.
Okay, great. So you also have a special reading by Dr. Rashid. So please do that. That would be great. Let me see if I don't think we have any more questions. Let me just double check, please. Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Rashid, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Your book is great, and we are so glad that you were able to come here today, virtually, I guess. But we really thank you for this, and we will hopefully I'll get links from you so that we can send it to everybody. But everybody, please buy the book because it's a great book. So please do that. And
I'll send you a link where people can access the book online.
Oh, okay, great. And
purchase it.
Yeah, and we'll include that. We'll tweet it out. We'll put it on our website and stuff. So please, please check that out. Just follow our website, our Twitter account, our Facebook, and you'll find it. And yeah, so thank you so much for this talk. This has been great. We really appreciate it. Is there any final comment that you want to leave about the book, or just in general about the whole issue itself?
I mean, the only thing I would say is that there's, even though the current horizon looks very gloomy with annexation looming, with the most hostile administration in U.S. history to Palestine in office, um, I think there are reasons for optimism. I suggested some of them, especially in this country. I think we've turned a corner as far as public opinion is concerned. That still doesn't manifest itself either in the mainstream corporate media or on the political level, but I think we actually have begun. We've turned a corner. It's going to require enormous work and dedication, money, young people continuing to do what they've done, and Palestinian and Palestinian American civil society continuing to exert efforts. But I think there's an openness to the Palestinian narrative in the United States and Europe that wasn't there before. When I was a student, Golda Meir came to my university and spoke, and there were hundreds of demonstrators in support of her, and there were 4 of us. Today on American campuses, demonstrations in support of Palestine are just as large as or larger than demonstrations in support of Israel. It's inconceivable in light of what I remember from 45 or 50 years ago. And that's a sign of change. That change has affected American academia. That change has affected many, many other groups in American society. It's affected the base of the Democratic Party. We saw that with Bernie Sanders' candidacy. We saw that with the platform fight over Jerusalem in the 2016 Democratic Convention. We see that even in Congress with a group of people who were supporting measures that were inconceivable a while ago. They won't be passed into law, but you actually have people in Congress who are supporting aspects of Palestinian rights. That just never happened before. It requires a lot of work to turn that into more than just turning the corner. But I think there's every reason for optimism.
Sure.
And so I leave you with that, and thank everybody for taking part.
Yeah, and then quick question: do you mind? Because I pulled up the Amazon link. Do you prefer Amazon or another link?
I don't care. I will send you a link to something where you can buy it from Amazon or other.
All right. Well, I'm gonna just send this to the people that are online now so that they can check it out.
The link that gives you pretty much everything is either the Macmillan, the company that owns my publisher, is
Macmillan.
Yeah, and the other, which is really good, is bookshop.org.
Right.
Or its local bookstores. So if you don't want to give money to the Amazon mammoth.
Yeah, some people don't like to.
Yeah, I will send you that link. It's bookstore.org. Bookshop. I'm sorry, I apologize. Bookshop.org. I'll send you the link, Mohammed, right now.
Okay, and actually,
you can either go on the Macmillan site. Macmillan, the publisher, gives you the option of Amazon or this link or others. So it's up to you. You can buy it from Amazon, of course. Please buy it. If you're going to buy it, I don't care if it's Amazon or not.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I already sent the Amazon and Macmillan links, so hopefully people will grab.
Just sent you the bookshop.org. I just sent you the bookstore.org.
Okay.
On your email. Thanks for doing this.
No, thank you. It's always a pleasure. It's an honor to have you here virtually here at the Palestine Center. I can't thank you enough. This has been great, and I hope we can have you here again soon.
Inshallah.
But in the meantime, I wish you luck with the book and everything else that you're doing. And I hope I don't know if you'll be able to, are you going to make it back to New York pretty soon?
Eventually.
Okay. Well, I hope that goes well, and best of luck to you, and best wishes to you and your family.
Thank you, Mohammed. Same to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. Have a great day. And
you too.
Again, thank you so much for coming for doing this. We really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Salamat.
Bye-bye.
Bye.